Hello and welcome to our Syxsense April Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after to answer those. And with that, I'll pass things over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Johanna. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us. It is April. It's, you could say, the first month of spring, and we're just waiting for the rain to stop. Thank you very much for joining us today. We actually do have a lot to talk about, and those that have seen our release yesterday on the website will know that there's an awful lot of patches that Microsoft released that we need to talk about today. Before we do, we're going to recontinue the end of life news, and thank you to everybody that messaged me regarding the advice on in-place upgrades from Windows 10 to Windows 11. It is very important that you migrate to Windows 11 as soon as possible. October 14th, 2025 is the end of life for Windows 10 Enterprise. So that will come around very, very quickly. Windows Server 2012, we are now on ESU year 2. That has to have an end of life on 2026. And Windows 11 23H2 is end of life on the 10th of November 2026 as well. Now, after this, after last February, we won't have optional preview updates for Windows 11 22H2. You must move across to 23H2 as soon as possible. Regarding optional and preview releases, now we had a huge number of preview patches released at the end of March. This is really, really good news, and actually something that didn't happen in January, didn't really happen in February either. Those preview releases are not recommended by us to install on business devices. Those preview updates are actually not even supported by Microsoft. But in addition to all the testing Microsoft is doing, they're using the preview releases as a way of sort of having more exposure for testing than just the internal teams at Microsoft. And so you will find a lot of organizations are installing the preview releases simply to see this, if those patches are stable for their own environment. And through those preview releases, you can send your notes and your updates to Microsoft, and they can address anything such as blue screen, black screen, broken software conflicts, things like that. It's good to see we had preview releases last month. It does mean that we get some better stability in patches this month and going into the next month. Now, all of those end of lives don't include long-term servicing. So if you do actually have any long-term servicing LTSB or LTSC, you will actually have an awful lot more time to sort of use those operating systems until the standard end of life. We did have a 0 day. It's been a while since we had one. I think there's been 2 this year for Google. One 23.0.6.3.1.2.106 was released 2nd of April. So yeah, about a week ago. Now, I would love to tell you what was fixed. And as we saw in the last one, Google haven't released any details. So they said the details of this patch is going to be kept restricted until everyone is updated, and then we might tell you. So it could be a bad one, or we know that it is a 0 day and potentially is being weaponized. So under that specific condition, I would recommend that Google be added urgently into your deployment. One thing about this, and thank you so much for all of the questions about Google, Mozilla, Google, Edge, all act the same when it comes to patching. They are all what we call in-place updatable. In-place updatable means that the Google browser can be open and it can be updated in the background. That will actually fix the binary or bring the binary up to the latest version, securing that device from any kind of exploit. The open browser is in what we call a memory sandbox. And that memory sandbox is isolated, nothing goes in, nothing comes out. And under that condition, even though the app is open, if the binary on the PC is updated, all you have to do is close the browser and reopen it, and you will then open the new version of that Google Chrome browser. So you do not need to, in many cases, ask the user to close down their Google browser in order to update it. And that is the same for Edge, and that's the same for Mozilla as well. And lastly, Caesar did put out a notification. Sometimes they do this from time to time, but Adobe did get an update basically saying that cyber threat actors could exploit some of the vulnerabilities to take control of an affected system. And they gave us a nice list. In this list, Photoshop, I know we have here at Syxsense, there is no Adobe Reader impacted or Adobe Acrobat. So potentially, these may be in your organization. There are some here I think are very old and potentially maybe obsolete or have been replaced, but please do make sure that if you are using those Adobe products, that you get them updated as soon as possible. Now, I mentioned we had a large update from Microsoft. In fact, let me just recap that. It is the largest that I have ever seen, and potentially the largest that there has ever been. There have been more fixes in this release than I think combined for the entire year. To put that into perspective, 147 new fixes. 3 were critical, 142 were important, and there was a couple of NAs as well. Now, what was really interesting was the types of fixes that we got in here, and I'm going to cover that a little bit later when we head over to Syxsense.com, that we did have an awful lot of .NET, and we had an awful lot of SQL Server. So 2 particular types of parts of the operating system that were specifically targeted, and there's literally pages and pages of them. So it's really interesting that either these bugs have just been suddenly found, or there has been a release of .NET or a release of SQL that certainly find all these bugs. One or the other. We probably need to address some of those really very quickly. Of the 147, 14 are more likely to be weaponized as per Microsoft, but none of them are until about 6 hours ago. So we're going to cover what was weaponized, and it's really important that this was yesterday's slide, and today we had one notified to us that one actually become weaponized. But it's really important that Syxsense customers know that as a vulnerability becomes weaponized, it will actually change within your console within 4 hours automatically. None are publicly aware. We did have 6 jump points, and that's really an important vector to be aware of, especially when you're designing the strategy on what patches you're going to include, especially with such a massive list of patches. How do you choose which ones are going to make the greatest effect to reduce your attack surface within your organization? Now, we're also going to look at the bug types. This is kind of the second factor of how you're choosing what vulnerabilities in this Patch Tuesday list you're going to remediate. And actually each patch, each vulnerability that is solved comes under one of these bug types. Now, the one at the top, remote code execution, is and remains this year the highest number of fixes. This remote code execution is a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute commands or place malware or other malicious code on your computer or network. 68 of those. Just putting that into perspective, that is more than we had for the entirety of March. So we had 68 remote code execution vulnerabilities fixed. Elevation of privilege is a threat actor gains access to an employee account, bypasses a proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. We had 31 of those, just ahead of security feature bypass, which is when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. 26 of those. And then what's really interesting is that security feature bypass hasn't had more than, I think, 5 in any month for the last 6 months. So I was super interested to see that jump up just as I look back over the last 6 or so months of history. Information disclosure, that's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information, like a password, an NTLM hash, for example. 12 of those were fixed. Denial of service, we had 7 of those. That's an attack that's meant to simply shut down the machine, cause carnage to your IT workforce. And lastly, spoofing. Spoofing is very similar to that of an information disclosure, but that's an act of disguising communication or identity. So once again, this is a second form of selecting patches. If you're a Syxsense customer, we combine all this together. If you're not, then we may need to look at some of the bug types to choose the ones that we fear the most. Of course, we fear the most remote code execution, and that is another selection criteria to help you roll out the most the, the patches that solve the very worst of these exploitable vulnerabilities. You can also use what we recommend as a SQL score. Now, SQL score is a combination of different elements of a vulnerability. So we have the vendor severity. Of course, the vendor, they issue their own severity from critical, high, medium, low, and of course, if it doesn't have any severity at all, it's an NA. Obviously, from worst to least worst. CVSS score is a number calculated out of 10. That's actually an independent score as well, that is generated by the vendor, but then reassessed by an independent body, which is stored over at NIST. And what they do is they calculate the precise conditions that a vulnerability must have in order to become exploitable. And so when you take that into consideration, you find that sometimes the vendor will release something NA severity or maybe high, but the CVSS score rates it critical. It's important to have this transparency when you're selecting patches, that you have all the information that you could possibly need at your fingertips to justify why you're deploying only a subset of patches, especially when you have such a large number to deploy. Then you've got the state of the vulnerability. Now, weaponized status means is actively being exploited. Now, we work with Microsoft and our other antivirus partners to help feed information to us that this particular CVE is being used in an exploit campaign somewhere in the world. And when that is recognized and recorded as such, we call that a weaponized vulnerability. Weaponized vulnerabilities can happen to any severity of patch. And actually, that's really important because not only are those weaponized vulnerabilities being exploited when it's not critical, a lot of vendors don't retrospectively change the severity after that has happened. So once again, we're adding this in to provide you more details on how you can select the patches that solve the vulnerabilities that are most important for you. Public aware is the second kind of state. Public aware does not mean we know about it, that you know about it. You've joined a webinar like this one to learn about it. Public aware means that maybe a bug bounty program or some hacker has released the exact conditions in which an exploit can be exploited. Now, that doesn't mean it guarantees it will be weaponized, but I wouldn't want to be an IT manager that knew something was public aware, maybe it had been on a YouTube channel or a forum, and it wasn't weaponized at the time, so I didn't include it in my strategy. I always recommend to include public aware, and if you can do so, maybe not as in phase one, maybe in, say, if you're doing rings or if you're doing groups, get your group A's out. That's the most important ones, but always include these afterwards in a second rollout in the month. Now, to balance that, we have countermeasures. Now, countermeasures are one of two. You've got mitigations or you've got workarounds. And mitigations might mean that maybe you don't have that software in your environment, or maybe you've got a particular configuration or a particular version of that software. Okay, you might be mitigated for it, or you may be able to deploy a workaround. So you may be able to, via group policy or intra-AD as it's now called in Azure, you may be able to deploy a group policy setting, change a registry key, and that removes the vulnerability from being exploitable. And if you can find these countermeasures and deploy them, maybe it's a lot easier and faster than a 1.5 gigabyte update. Lastly, you need to combine everything together into your exposure. So based on your exposure and those other 5 elements, you will be able to identify which of the vulnerabilities you're going to tackle, which ones of the patches you're going to deploy in the order that best suits the risk profile of any of the patches we list. Now, if you're not using Syxsense, that's perfectly fine. We're going to show you actually how to work that out yourself. To do that, we're going to go across to syxsense.com, and I brought across my browser. Now, this is obviously our homepage where we have access to all of our resources. If you're not a Syxsense customer and you would like to know a bit more, use the chat function. Ask us any questions such as white papers or any of our previous webinars. Or if you'd like to see the product, use the book a demo button up in the corner. What we're interested in is the resources page. Now, the resources page contains all of our released materials. I don't know if you know about the GigaOhm radar, but we actually are right in the center there, which is really fantastic. We also have our news and our events, and our vulnerability database is open for everyone to go check it out and see what vulnerabilities you can address in your organization if you find them. Now, over here, you also have the news page to the Patch Tuesday links, and here we have the Patch Tuesday link that went live yesterday. And through here, you can actually send us an email if you have any questions or concerns, or maybe potentially you'd like some advice on a test strategy on how you test before you deploy. We'd love to help. Now, of the 147 fixes, this massive release, we did have 3 that were critical in nature that covered Windows, components, Microsoft Office, Azure, .NET Framework. I mentioned .NET Framework had a ton load of fixes this month, SQL Server, and Windows Secure Boot. And it's quite interesting. I was watching another blog just earlier on, and they call it Windows Secure Boot, but they've had so many fixes. I'm not sure if secure is the right word for it. And as I said earlier, this is the largest update in 5 years that I've been doing this webinar, and I think it's the largest ever. Now, if we compare to last month, now we have this huge number of vulnerabilities. When we compare it to last month, and you add all of the CVSS scores together, we come out with over 1,100. Again, we've never had a release that high, with the average of 7.6, which is the same average as last month. So what that tells you is that even though last month we had less updates, and this month we had more updates, 7.6 is actually still quite severe on the CVSS score. So although we had twice as many or three times as many combined CVSS scores this month, everything is still very severe. So I would take everything above 7 as a potential deployment at some point in your calendar month. So we take a look down here. My first recommendation is 2024 29988. If you're not a Syxsense customer, just take that CVE number, pop it into your tool set, and look at your exposure. If this is highly exposed in your environment, please make sure you deploy this. This is a smart screen prompt security feature bypass vulnerability. It's been in our top 3 a couple of times already this year. Now, there's very little information on this, super few details about it. But the last time this happened, it was because of a vulnerability with mark of the web. Mark of the web is a type of security on a file. So when you download something or you transfer a file from an email to your PC, the file itself knows that it came from an unsecure original place. So whether that came from the internet or from an email, it doesn't trust it. Now, the mark of the web says this is an untrusted file and challenges the user to say, are you sure this is not a trusted file that's come from a trusted source? Now, that can be bypassed. Now, if you can bypass it, then you could potentially deliver something in an email that looks absolutely something you're expecting. You can open it up and boom, you've now delivered this virus to your PC. So it's hugely important that is number one. That hasn't yet been weaponized, but some have suggested that it could have become weaponized or will become weaponized. At this point on Microsoft, it has not become weaponized, but doesn't mean that you shouldn't deploy it. Its attack vector is network, which means any connection, including the internet. Attack complexity low, privilege required none, and user interaction is required to exploit this. My second one is 2024-20678. This is a remote procedure call. These are quite old school libraries that are used across all of Microsoft operating systems. And this is a remote code execution vulnerability. Now, to exploit this vulnerability, an authenticated attacker would need to send a specially crafted RPC call to an RPC host. And this could result in a remote code execution on the server side with the same permissions as the RPC service, which usually is local system, i.e. full admin. And any authenticated user could trigger the vulnerability. It doesn't require admin or other elevated privileges. Now, this is also vendor severity rated important, CVSS 8.8. It can be its attack vector is network, which is any network including the internet. Attack complexity low, privilege required low, user interaction none, and luckily it doesn't have a jump point. And lastly, of the three, before I get to my Easter egg, is 2024-26158. Actually found this very difficult to select from a huge list of lots of those vulnerabilities that all had similar vendor severities and CVSSs. It was quite difficult for me to select. So I went with this one because the vulnerability has exploitation more likely. So from the vendor themselves, they're saying this is one that is likely to be used. This is a Microsoft install service elevation of privilege vulnerability. So effectively, it's controlling the installation of any software on your PC. It has, of course, its own security around what is able to be run on a PC and also who is able to run software on a PC. So I think that's pretty serious. Now, this an attacker that successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain system privileges. So from there, potentially they could do other things. This has a CVSS score of 7.8. Its attack vector is local, so you do need local access to the network, meaning that you have to connect to a device, and then from there you can connect to another device. You can't do it over the internet, which actually is a good thing. Its attack complexity is low, its privileges required is low, and the user interaction is none. Now, for all of the other vulnerabilities in this list, we go ahead and reference. Now, this is a priority order of the 6 factors we mentioned. We include everything from the impact, the exploitability assessment as well, along with the vendor severity, CVSS, whether it's weaponized, etc. Additional details in case you need to see under specific conditions where this might become exploitable, or in fact, if you come down here, you can see the jump points, where jump points indicate that a vulnerability, if exposed, could leap from one technology across to another. Now let's go to our Easter egg. Our Easter egg is CVE 2024-26234. This is recently updated, I think about 4 or 5 hours ago, and it has been marked as exploited. So this is our weaponized Easter egg. It originally was released with a CVSS score of 6.7. This is a proxy driver spoofing vulnerability. Now, you're probably wondering, as I did, what is a proxy driver? Well, I don't really know exactly what it is. So I'm going to give you another page here where I've been doing some reading on it. Its risk is relatively low, I would say. Its attack vector is local, attack complexity is low, privilege required is high, meaning you do need to have substantial rights to the PC. User interaction is none. Scope is unchanged, which is the jump point. And very little information about it other than it's both exploited as a weaponized vulnerability and publicly aware. There are patches available for it. Now, what is a proxy driver spoofing vulnerability? Now, I could find very little on it as well. So I went to Microsoft, did some search, and I found that it's something to do with storage area networks, that this is something that storage area networks are sort of using this proxy driver to access those storage area networks. So if you are using storage area networks, I would probably recommend that you install this. If this is part of a cumulative update and you're not using storage area networks, then deploy it anyway, just in case. But actually, I think that this is probably not that important to make my top 3. But we will keep an eye on this. Now, it is also important, as I said, to track the weaponized status. Weaponized status can happen at any time. And when it does, it's important that you have a solution like Syxsense that will then go and activate the weaponized status flag in the content, which you can use to make the best decision possible about the patches you're installing that month. Thank you very much for joining me today. That's it. I'm afraid we've got about 5 minutes to go. I'll let you have the rest of your day. I do hope that you found this really useful, and please do get in contact if you have any questions. And until May, I wish you happy patching. Thank you.